Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
Story number 1. Fury of the Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, we had a werewolf problem our first year when we moved into our second farm when I was a kid. I don't want to get into personal family details because they are embarrassing, but we lost our larger farm, and we were lucky to have gotten our hands on this smaller and more rural farm. If we hadn't, we would have had to move to a rental apartment and get minimum wage jobs, since we had no training in anything other than farm work. In those days, it was just me, Dad, and Mom. This was a few years before I met Gloria and started my own family. I forget if I was 18 or 19, but I was done with school and working full-time with Dad on the farm. We always set out to do the work of a full team of men, even though it was only the two of us. When it's your own family farm, you're willing to do whatever you have to do. After losing our first farm, we were grateful to have to get up before dawn and get back to work each morning. We were deathly afraid of losing that second and smaller farm, the three of us. And we didn't really get secure financially until Gloria came along later, bringing a wave of good luck with her. My late mom used to love her and called her Gloria in Excelsis Deo, which, I don't know, I guess it was an old song or something. I know she meant it as a compliment. When we were there the first few months of that first year, people from the area kept asking us how our werewolf was doing, and if we had seen the werewolf yet. We would laugh and say, yeah, sure, we saw the werewolf, because we thought we were being hazed as the newcomers to the region. That is, until one day when Mom came running out to the field to tell us that she had seen the werewolf, and it bluff charged her, sending her running back to the house. She told us it was hairy and stood on two legs like a man, but it was too large to be a man. She named this guy from our last church that was really tall, who used to work as a wrestler and a bouncer, and then she said that the werewolf, well, he was taller than that guy. I remember I kept looking from Mom to Dad to Mom to Dad, hoping that this was some kind of a joke. Dad looked more and more worried as she told her tale, though. I hadn't seen that look on Dad's face since we lost the last farm. I felt so angry that this was happening to us. A werewolf trying to kill my mother? Really? I was getting a persecution complex, like the entire universe thought it was funny to mess up our lives for some reason. I was a teenager, though, so it was kind of my job to feel persecuted, I guess. Dad and I headed over to where Mom had her encounter. We saw where the creature had walked from, and we saw the direction he was heading to, before Mom interrupted him in his journey. Dad pointed out that he was heading into our land, from an area whose owner we weren't ever sure of. It might have been public land, but we never looked into finding out, and there were no signs posted that we could see. The two of us set about figuring out how we could fence off that pathway into our farm. Let the Dogman go play on that unmarked land. That was fine with us. Just don't come on our land and scare my mom. It wasn't 2 more days before we had a fence and a gate with a lock, just like as if we were living in the city. Only we weren't afraid of criminals. We were afraid of the Dogman. Soon after, the second incident happened. This was the big one, where all 3 of us saw the beast. Our chicken coop was just around the back of the house, and we could all hear them getting upset, like if a fox happened by or something like that. Then we could shout out the window to scare the varmint off, or go downstairs and chase it off if need be. Well, the night in question here, we all woke up to the sound of that Dogman throwing an absolute temper tantrum, screaming, bellowing, roaring, and tearing our chicken coop to shreds. We all ran down there in time to see the chickens all over the yard, with the coop being torn down by this huge lunatic. At first, to me, it looked like a man wearing a furry mask and furry pants, but then I saw that his forearms were furry as well. I'm trying to say that this creature had a lot of bald spots, and a few hairy ones, where you could see his skin. It looked basically, sort of Caucasian, or at least I would say lighter toned. If this was a werewolf, He might have been Asian, Hispanic, Arab, or white, as his skin was like a light-skinned man with a deep tan, you might say. But I don't think it was a werewolf. I think it was some kind of a wild animal. A dogman, in other words, but a very humanoid-looking one. I have seen images online of bears with mange, and I can understand how they might get confused with dogman in brief sightings from a distance when they're standing on their hind legs. I really do. But this creature literally tore our henhouse apart with his claws or hands or whatever they were. He was far too strong to have mange. Mom was right in that it stood taller than any man I had ever seen. Everything she said had described it accurately. I had kind of been hoping she was exaggerating, to be honest. But sadly, my mom was very honest. Sadly in this case, I mean. We were facing a really big and really violent problem. Dad fired his rifle once into the air to get the creature's attention, and he succeeded. The dogman responded by turning around and firing one of the chickens, like a fastball, into Dad's belly, knocking him over backward. I picked up Dad's weapon where it lay, and I began firing directly at that varmint, wrecking our property. I could have sworn I hit it multiple times, but it never reacted as though I had. It just sort of ran and jumped out of sight in a few moves, and then it was gone. The next morning, as the men showed up that Daddy had called to come help us fix the chicken coop, they told us that the fence around the front of our property, which they had just helped us install days earlier, was already torn up out of the ground. We had all set the poles in concrete embedded deep into the rocky ground, and yet, somehow, several of the posts had been ripped up out of the dirt, and the entire fence was knocked over. How the hell do you tear a metal pole up out of concrete in the ground? I mean, you don't. You'd need some kind of heavy equipment for that. But we saw no tracks from a big Caterpillar truck over there or anything like that. Plus, after seeing what he did to our chicken coop, we kinda knew exactly who had done this to our fence. So it seems that this creature did not appreciate our attempt to force him to choose another walking route at night. We decided to take the rest of the fencing down since it wasn't going to be allowed to stand anyway, and we just worked on fixing the chicken coop instead. Mom continued to see the dogman near the spot she had originally seen him, but she avoided him each time and he didn't chase her anymore. We begged her to stop taking that path, since there were other options. But she was a very single-minded woman. Dad and I sort of eventually noticed that she stopped talking about the werewolf. When Dad brought it up over dinner one time, she told us she hadn't seen the creature in a long while. It was one of those things. She didn't even notice he was gone. She always just operated assuming he might be nearby. All three of us had altered our lives because of that beastman. We all carried bear spray with us at all times, for instance. And we kept doing that sort of thing for probably over a year after Mom's last sighting. It took us a long time before we started feeling normal again. Before life felt normal again. But it eventually did. The dogman found some other path to walk, and our business improved to the point where we were able to rise back up out of poverty. You naturally become stronger people after you survive. The Fury of the Werewolf. Story number 2. Full Moon Werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Here's a kind of an odd one for you. I saw Dogman twice, or at least I saw something that looked like a Dogman. I'll tell you what happened, then you can decide for yourself what that thing actually was. The first sighting was in Holy Rosary Cemetery, which is just north of Johnsonburg, PA. As any young man growing up in Johnsonburg will tell you, they named the place after us men who lived there. If you catch my drift, ladies. That was sort of the sense of humor my bunch of guys in those days had when I was around 20 years old. And yet for some reason, we still had girlfriends anyway. I guess that was the golden era of dating or something. Of course, we always had weird girlfriends. They always claimed to be Wiccan priestesses and all that, but still, we did have girlfriends. I think women were more patient back then or something, I don't know. So me and my two dork friends were hanging with these 3 young women who were way too pretty to be dating us, but simultaneously way too crazy to be out of a mental hospital. The group of us used to hang in the woods at the very edge of a cemetery to get the vibe of the evening and smoke each other out. If we boys didn't see any security, and if the girls didn't detect any bad anti-Wicca vibes or whatever, then we go out and sit around this really creepy, sad statue of this hippie guy nailed to a cross while people were crying. These girls claimed they disliked Christianity, but when it was as creepy as this statue of life-sized crying people, well, they loved it. You know, they have fixed the security holes that used to exist at that cemetery, so I want to advise you not to do what we did. The place is very well kept up these days, and nothing like this could happen in current year. But this didn't happen now. It happened way back then. Sometimes on the trippier nights, I would think I was seeing those creepy Jesus statues move, or at least one of them at a time. It would feel like they would move out of place when you would turn to look at them, and then they would get back in place quickly. We were always partying over there though, so we couldn't be sure we weren't just seeing things. But this event I'm about to describe to you was something we all saw, and we all ran away from. So I'm pretty certain this was not an optical illusion. We were sitting around Jesus and the Sad People and chilling when my buddy's girlfriend started whispering in my girlfriend's ear. I asked them what was up, and the two of them started squinting and pointing out over the tombstones to the other side of the graveyard. I joined them in squinting, and soon I saw something that both confused and frightened me. There was this really big guy running like a maniac toward us. And I mean like a maniac. I wondered if it was someone we knew, but the closer it got, the more confused I got. Whoever that was seemed to be wearing a monster mask. No, an entire monster costume. I was thinking how hot he must be running in that costume, when the light of the full moon showed me that was not a man in a costume. I didn't know what it was, but it was alive. And that was its own real fur. We realized this seemed to be a Dogman racing at us. And suddenly it wasn't just the girls that were screaming, as we each ran off in a different direction, away from that religious statue. My girlfriend and I ran to the edge of the woods and peeked out from behind the tree. One of my friends was hiding behind a tombstone, but we were all sort of braced for impact, if you know what I mean. Not everyone got a clear view of this, but my girlfriend and I watched that monster man, who had a distinctly canine head, race right past the statue of the life-size Jesus on the cross, and into the woods behind the cemetery. Once it was gone, it was like all six of us went ape. We were all hooting and hollering and jumping up and down, like we had just seen a touchdown run or something. I guess we were dumb kids, but that was quite a show we got to witness on that night. So that was why we went back the next night, armed this time with cameras of various kinds. We didn't have good cameras on cell phones yet. This was back around the turn of the century, so I'm talking about us bringing Kodachrome kind of stuff, from snapshot cameras to a Canon professional camera that my friend had, and one big VHS video camera that weighed a stupid amount. We all went to the cemetery each night for the next week, waiting for the Dogman, determined to capture evidence this time. Then we did the same the week after, but the girls were growing restless. By the third week of waiting for Doggo, everyone was starting to get cranky. We no longer were just enjoying each other's company and chilling. We were so uptight about finding proof of the Dogman that we had seen so unexpectedly that first night. By the time a month had passed, even my girlfriend was sick of the entire thing. I argued that we should give it one final shot, since it was the 1-month anniversary, and the moon would be out full, making it brighter and easier to get a good photograph. Nobody cared, though. Everyone was worn out, and I was, along with the rest of them. I stayed home that night instead, actually crashing out in bed a lot earlier than usual. I remember waking up around, I guess, midnight or 1, and I looked outside my bedroom window. Well, don't you know I saw him. I saw the Dogman, the same one from that night in the cemetery, or else his identical cousin from the Patty Duke show. He was doing the same thing as last time I saw him, tear-assing across the grass, running like he just stole somebody's hubcap. I ran around my room looking for my little black Kodak camera. Then I remembered I had left it downstairs and I ran down to fish it out of my jacket pocket in the front hallway. Then I remember racing out the front of the house in the night in my underpants, running around looking for the Dogman. I ran completely around the house and my socks got soaking wet from the dew on the grass, or maybe it had just rained, I don't remember. I just remember running around the house one final time before accepting that wherever the Dogman was, he was long gone. I pulled off my wet socks and I walked around to the front of the house in my underpants, feeling very defeated. Then I saw that the front door had swung shut and locked, and I realized I had no key in my underpants, and that I was locked out there in the night with the Dogman. So I walked around the house one more time, this time checking the other doors and windows to see if maybe I could sneak back in through one of them. I eventually got my fingers under one of the looser dining room windows, and I was trying to push it up, but I found it was half locked. So then I found myself jiggling the window and trying to get the lock to open itself up. I got pretty intensely into what I was doing, and the entire world faded away. I needed to get back in that house before the Dogman came back. I was starting to shake in panic. It was beginning to get to me. So then I looked up, and I saw a terrifyingly angry face glaring back at me. No, it wasn't a reflection of the Dogman standing behind me. It was my father inside the house, wondering why I was trying to break one of his expensive windows. He made a motion toward the front door, and I marched back around, feeling extra stupid, like I was about to be in trouble. When I reached the door, my father's hand came out and grabbed me, dragging me inside roughly. "Get in here, you idiot! Do you want the neighbors to think you're a flasher?" I tried to explain what had happened, but somehow insisting that I saw the Michigan Dogman running through our yard in Pennsylvania, so I locked myself out of the house in my underpants, didn't sound as intelligent when I said it as it had sounded in my head when I thought it. Yes, anyway, the point of all this that we missed at the time was that both my sightings were on the night of the full moon. So maybe this wasn't even a Dogman at all. I mean, what if this was a werewolf? Like a man who changes into a Dogman when the full moon is out. It would make more sense, right? So my girlfriend told me she believed me, but my other friends did not, and I was unable to use this event to revive our stakeout nights at the cemetery. Plus, they'd beefed up their security at night, and that stopped being such a cool place to hang. And so I never again had any more chances to see the full moon werewolf. You can find no one finer than Sabrina. She's the finest person that we've never seen her. Please join me in thanking the great and immortal Sabrina Midkiff, who made a very generous donation to us during the brief 36 to 48 hours that we were recently and mysteriously demonetized. This donation was huge to us, not only in practical terms as we didn't know if we would have money for food, but it also felt awesome to know that somebody actually cared. I can't tell you how much that mattered in that moment, I really can't. And I can't thank Sabrina Midkiff enough for her kindness and generosity. Mistaken for a werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I had a weird Dogman experience. This is not a recent one either. Let's see, if I'm sending this to you in 2024, and it happened in 1999, that means... Oh wow, the story's now a quarter of a century old. And if I was 20 when it happened, well, I must be getting up in years, huh? I just started writing and I've already gotten myself depressed. I was in college at the time, but I was going to a school fairly close to home. I really could have even lived at home while going there, although it would have been an hour's drive to and from my classes. I was renting a room in a house within walking distance of the school, and I was a junior that year. But this stuff took place in my hometown, where my parents both still live. This is Wisconsin we're talking about here. and it's on the countryside of the suburbs, but I better not get more specific than that. Now obviously Wisconsin is known for werewolf sightings, and even back then around the turn of the century, people were already talking about the Dogman. He was pretty famous already, even though YouTube hadn't started up yet. Now I bought a werewolf or Dogman costume for Halloween that year, which was fairly realistic, at least by 1999 standards. If I stood in the shadows, I really looked like a werewolf, and you'll see later on in the story that I'm not just saying that. I sent you some links to costumes I found online that are sort of like the one I got that year, but I don't know if the one I bought is even still being made. It had shoulder pads to make me look bigger and stronger, and it had padding all over which made me look less like a man, and more like a canine. For instance, the legs were padded in such a way that it made me look like I had dog legs and not human ones. My head was completely covered with this dog-like werewolf mask, and when I put my clawed gloves on, I was completely hidden inside the costume. So I was getting this costume not for a big Halloween party at school, but for a girlfriend I had started up with who lived a couple blocks from my parents' house back in my hometown. She invited me to go trick-or-treating with her friends, and I guess I bought the expensive costume to show off that I was a little bit older than her high school senior friends. In those days, being 3 or 4 years older than the girl was still a good thing. I don't even know if men and women are allowed to date anymore. My kids are 7 and 5, so I guess I'll be finding out soon what the modern rules of romance are. The girl, let's call her Loretta, gave me a corner to meet up with her and her friends. She asked me what I was coming as, and I stupidly told her it was a surprise. The meeting corner was right by a spooky abandoned lot covered in trees, so just meeting there was sort of a Halloween dare. I saw some young people in costumes on the corner waiting, and I decided it would be funny to creep into the woods and sneak up behind those kids. Then I could jump out at them going "Rawr," and we could all have a good laugh. At least that was the way it played out in my mind, as I chuckled to myself and I got in position to leap out. Before I did though, I surveyed the people there and I didn't see Loretta, so I figured she must be late. I thought I should probably wait till she showed up before I pulled my hysterically funny prank, so that she would join in the laughter and see how awesome I was. I tried to find a comfortable position, but that costume was not really made for prowling through the woods. I started to sweat a lot in that costume, and then a cold October wind began to blow. The combination of hot and cold made me sneeze, which is not the thing you want to do when you have a full head mask on, generally speaking. So I had some stuff going on, and I didn't notice the boys from Loretta's group sneaking up behind me, sneaking up on them. They heard my sneeze and came to see who the man in the woods was. Only it wasn't a man. It was me. And in the dark under the tree cover, they really thought I was a Wisconsin werewolf. So they did what any other red-blooded young man would do in that situation. They beat the bejeebus out of me. Out of the monster in the woods, I mean. It was entirely in self-defense in their minds at the time, and I fully understand that. They didn't know that I wasn't going to hurt them or eat them, and they did the natural thing to do under the circumstances. Then they rolled me down this hill that I had no idea existed before I was getting banged up rolling down the side of it. I landed in a creek at the bottom, inhaling water and coughing and gagging until I could finally breathe again. I sat there in the water, getting my $100 suit all wet. And the next thing I knew, I was seeing stars and the lights got turned out. When I woke up, I could tell by the pain in the back of my head that I had been knocked out. Trying to get up proved to be a bad idea at first, so I slunk back down against a cold stone wall, and I tried to focus my eyes enough to look around the dark, smelly, freezing room I was now inside. At first all I could make out was my own breath in front of my face, but after some time I saw that I was inside a chamber in a hand-carved stone place, or maybe it was naturally formed. I couldn't really tell in the dark with my head aching. I was inside a room in a cave. That was where I realized I was. I was still, for some reason, wondering what I banged my head on, and how I ended up in this new place. I still hadn't put it together that someone had perpetrated violence upon my person, and then removed me bodily to this new premises. But that missing information was filled in for me in another few seconds. Into the room entered a large man wearing a similar costume to mine, carrying a large hunk of smelly, rotting meat hanging out of its costume's head's mouth. It tossed the meat to the floor in front of me and then demonstrated how he could move the jaw of his Dogman mask. Mine was stuck in place, never fully opening or shutting. That was where I looked out of, but this guy's costume was better than mine. The disgusting, rotting meat and the man in the costume both smelled absolutely awful, and I felt like I had somehow ended up in a new version of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, crossed with Deliverance. I tried to take my mask off, which now had dried sneeze all over the inside of it, but I found it was stuck and I couldn't get it off. This finally made me panic, as I have a bit of claustrophobia, and it kicked in that moment. As I struggled and writhed in an attempt to free my head from that big mask, I found myself being grabbed and roughly handled by that other weirdo in his fancier Dogman costume. It didn't take too long to figure out that this guy had some extremely bad intentions toward me, and I flailed about trying to get out of his grip. During the struggle, I turned and faced this man, and I saw his mask from inches away. Well, his nostrils flared. His eyes looked all around. His eyelids blinked. This was not a mask. This was a real Dogman. I found it hard to see much of anything, looking out through the mouth of the mask into the dark cave. But I saw a rock on the cave floor that I thought I could reach. Once I grabbed it, I returned the Dogman's favor from before, and I was able to clock him on the back of his noggin. He wasn't hurt badly, but he was surprised and he dropped me. That gave me the chance to run away, which I did, slamming face first into a stone wall. I kept readjusting my course and slamming into wall after wall, until I found myself a way out of that chamber, and eventually out of the cave entirely. Once I was outside, for some reason I found I could get the mask off, and I ran through the woods holding it tucked under my arm like it was a football. By chance, I ran into Loretta and her group, and since I had my mask off, they didn't beat me up any further. She seemed to think it was funny that I was covered in mud and leaves, and she invited me to join along with her friends for the rest of their trick-or-treating. I don't think I was gonna say yes, as young and girl-happy as I was in those days. Running into cave walls, getting kicked down a hill by Loretta's friends, getting knocked out by the monster, none of those things had put me in the mood to beg my neighbors for pieces of candy. But I never actually answered her yes or no. What happened instead was that the Dogman burst out of the woods behind me. Everyone saw him, and we all ran away, screaming like little girls, especially us boys. Honestly, I thought I'd lost the creature a long ways back, but you know about dogs and their homing instincts, right? Well, this guy was the homeliest of them all. It's a miracle that all I ended up with was some bruises. It could have gone so much worse. Since that time, I have worn other werewolf costumes on 2 other Halloweens. In both of those cases, however, I told all my friends beforehand what I was going as. In addition, I didn't sneak up behind anyone, and so I had no repeat problems of being mistaken for a werewolf. Hey, if you're wondering what costume the story submitter said was closest to what he remembers his costume being in the story from 1999, it was this one, the Seasonal Visions Men's Deluxe Werewolf costume. And if you would like to get your hands on one of these, we've got a link to their sale page on Target. If you do buy from that link, this channel would make a commission, just so you know. But if you do buy and wear this costume, keep a friend with you to let everyone know you aren't a real dogman or werewolf, just an incredible simulation. I am a real werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am an old lady who listens to your show, but I wasn't always old. And when I was young, I was stupid. That's probably why I ended up letting a real werewolf pick me up. It's basically a miracle that I lived to tell my story, but I did. So buckle your seatbelt while I stop on the gas and get us going. This story happened when I was in my early 20s, back during the Civil War. I'm just kidding, it wasn't quite that long ago, but it probably was before a lot of you were born, I'm guessing. I had dropped out of college and gotten a job typing in an office. It paid enough for me to live alone in a small apartment, and for me to go out drinking almost every night of the week. That was my thing back then. I had gotten into the habit of nearly nightly bar hopping while in college, and some of my friends helped me keep the tradition going after we dropped out and got day jobs. We really had no aim or plan in those days. But during that time, it never felt like there was any reason to plan for the future or to think things out. We were all sorta still half waiting for Prince Charming, even while we had already become a generation of women who went to work. I think me and my friends were really just confused. We weren't sure what we wanted. As long as the music kept blaring and the booze kept pouring, we didn't really care too much either. Nah, I don't want to make it sound like my girlfriends and I slept around every single night. That would be entirely unfair to say that. It was more like we slept around every second or third night. A girl's gotta sleep sometimes, you know. What does any of this have to do with the Dogman? Well, you'd be surprised. In those days, stores like Corvettes had started doing this thing where you could get a custom t-shirt made. You could have a picture of yourself, of your favorite celebrity. You could have a slogan printed on it, anything you wanted. At the time, this was mind-blowing to my group of friends, and we all went around in these hideous t-shirts with our nicknames on them and pictures of butterflies or kittens. When you would see guys in these kinds of one-shot t-shirts, it was usually like World's Greatest Husband or that kind of thing. But one night, at one of the bars I was hanging at, a guy walked in with one of these Corvettes t-shirts that turned out to be a real conversation starter. You see, he was wearing a t-shirt that proudly proclaimed, "I am a real werewolf." Now, a few of us girls were intrigued at this scruffy-looking but muscle-bound stranger and his interesting t-shirt. In those days, the images and text would be applied with heat. It wasn't the nicer way they print them today. In fact, we called them iron-on t-shirts, and there were home versions of designs that sometimes came like in cereal boxes and whatnot, which you could iron onto your own t-shirt. I remember walking over and touching the iron-on design of this stranger's t-shirt, and I was surprised at the image under the headline. It looked so real. It looked to me like a photograph of a real werewolf, but one like I had never seen before. It didn't look like it was from a movie or like Dark Shadows. It didn't look like a makeup job applied to a man. In fact, from the neck up, it didn't even look like a man at all. It looked like some kind of a monstrous wolf head up on top of furry, muscular human male shoulders. The creature in the image was a dark brown, and you could barely make it out across the room. It was so dark brown on the black t-shirt that it was almost invisible from a distance, while the large block-lettered pale-colored headline reading, "I am a real werewolf," blared out from his chest, readable from a great distance, probably readable from space. The lettering was so bold and plain. I asked him where he got that picture of that werewolf because I assumed it was from a movie I had not seen. The guy would not answer my question directly. Instead, he just kept saying that if I played my cards right, I could find out the answer to that and a whole lot of other questions too. I had no idea what he was talking about or what he found so funny about my questions. So a few of us girls swarmed around this new guy, the werewolf. but I was the only one asking questions about him. The others were trying to get him to buy them drinks or to dance with them, but I kept asking about his t-shirt. I kept asking what his story was. After a while, he and I went to a corner table so I could ask him more questions about himself, and he could enjoy not giving me straight answers. Pretty soon I was splitting the bar with this guy. My mother would later ask me why I didn't tell any of my friends where the werewolf guy and I were heading off to when we left. But she didn't understand. I was competing against my friends to get to be the girl he took home. I wasn't going to let the competition know what was going on at the time. I didn't want them to know where I was going. Which was just as well, because once we were in this guy's convertible, I had no idea where we were going anyway. I just knew we were heading there fast, and that the car was careening all over the road. If someone was in the right lane, we passed on the left. If someone was in the left lane, well, we just passed them on the right. This guy kept telling me that rules are for humans. Rules are not for werewolves. I felt like that was an attitude that was going to get this guy thrown in prison sooner or later. I saw no future for him except crime, violence, and debauchery. And since I was in my early 20s, of course, this meant I found him incredibly attractive. I asked him how he had come to become a werewolf, and he asked me how I had become a beautiful woman. I thought about it and I admitted I didn't know. He nodded and admitted that he didn't know either. I took that to mean he had always been a werewolf, but I don't really know if that's exactly what he meant or what. By the way, I kept avoiding mentioning the werewolf guy's name because it wasn't anything scary or exotic. It wasn't very werewolfy at all. He wasn't named Quentin Collins or anything cool. He was just Steve. Steve the muscle guy with the werewolf t-shirt. He had somewhat long hair, but most young guys did back then, and he had a few days' growth of beard. But to me, he looked like a Playgirl centerfold waiting for me to take the staples out of his belly button, if you know what I mean, ladies. You younger listeners are going to have to ask your grandparents what I'm talking about. So, Steve the hunky werewolf guy parked the car on a dark old highway by the forest, and I thought he was going to start to try to make out with me. But instead, he jumped out of the car and he came around and opened my door. Then he took me by the hand, and he started leading me into the dark woods, telling me he's got a little place back there in the forest. Now, I thought this was the most romantic thing I could ever imagine happening, because I was kind of an idiot. And I was visualizing a cute cabin by a waterfall, with the moon shining down, and crickets chirping. When we finally reached his little place in the woods, though, it turned out to be a tiny, filthy, ramshackle shack more than anything else. There was one room inside, and an old stained mattress on a dirt floor. Not exactly romantic, but I was young and stupid, so no red flags went off in my naive little brain. I had hoped for a nicer room and a fireplace, but if I didn't claim this werewolf dude first, one of my friends was going to steal him from me. I was determined to keep him as my own, as I had lost the last 3 competitions over men with those other girls. We weren't very mature, but we did end up with a lot of adventures and stories to tell. So I figured I knew why the guy had brought me out there, and I figured I was okay with all of that, but then something started to go down that I found more than a bit unexpected. The guy started sweating and moaning like he was going to be ill. I asked him if he was okay, and he said yeah. He was just changing into his werewolf form, and it could get painful during parts of the change. I was like instantly sober, and I sat up to look at him. What did he just said? He tried to repeat himself, but he was having too much trouble with whatever illness had started overtaking him. It wasn't just that he was shaking all over. It was like each individual muscle of his body was spasming, independently of all the other muscles. It looked almost as though his body were in flux, down to a molecular level. It really did look at points more like I was watching a combination of billions of cells, more than like I was seeing one consistent human being. And then, he just stopped even resembling a human being at all anymore. His body was just as or even more muscular than earlier, only now he was covered in dark fur as well. Now his face didn't look like Steve anymore. Now his face looked like the head of a vicious, snarling dogman or wolfman. He started to look more and more like the image on his t-shirt. The werewolf image that looked like a real photo but couldn't have possibly been. Well, maybe it could have possibly been. Maybe that was a photograph of this guy Steve himself. Maybe he really was a werewolf. Maybe I had made a big mistake. I crashed out of there and made a break for it, exiting the shack and running initially back toward the car, until I realized that made very little sense. I didn't have the keys to that convertible, so there was no reason to run in that direction. I didn't know where I should be going, but then Steve burst out of the shack, trying to call my name, but coughing on the words. By then, he was half man and half animal, staggering toward me and pleading with me to stay. He looked like a horror movie though, and I can't honestly say I was ever more scared. Not before, and not since. He might have actually meant well. He might have just been asking me to stay, but to me, a monster more frightening than any ever created in Hollywood was reaching out for me, its hand looking more like a claw or paw by that point in the evening. I screamed like I was Fay Ray, or I don't know, Linnea Quigley or something. I was the scream queen of that forest on that night, and I think it was because I didn't think I would survive long enough to be the final girl. I ran like a chicken with my head cut off, probably running in circles because I had no idea what to do, and I was freaking out. I was wearing bar shoes, not forest shoes, so that didn't help. I must have looked idiotic and pathetic because that was how I felt. Why did I let a guy claiming to be a werewolf drive off with me? How could that have turned out any differently? And yet, he had seemed like so much fun back at the bar. I had assumed he was joking about the whole Wolfman thing. Well, let me tell you, I decided as I stumbled away from that scene that from then on, when someone told me that they were a werewolf, I was gonna believe them. I know some people out there think that werewolves make good boyfriends, but I'm not so sure. Although at first he was pleading with me to stay, after a while, all I heard from him was growling and snarling. When I would turn around to see him pursuing me, he invariably had an expression of utter horror on his face. He looked like a monster more than he looked like either a man or an animal. I don't think I made a mistake by running away. I don't think I would have been safe if I had stayed. At the very least, I think I would have been injured, but it could have been a whole lot worse than that. I'm not personally a big fan of pain and blood. I have been known to faint from the slightest bit of either one, and this whole werewolf situation looked like it might be leading to a whole lot of both. I remember running, and I remember sort of imagining all the ways my life could have turned out differently. Like they say, your life flashes in front of your eyes when you think it's about to be all over. Well, that was sort of like what this was like. I felt panic, but also shame and embarrassment. I was letting my mother down. She always told me to be careful. How much less careful can you be than following a werewolf into the woods so he can eat you? I remember feeling as red-faced embarrassed as I was horrified. I was about to be facing down either St. Peter or Beelzebub, and in either case, I was going to have a hard time explaining how I could have been so stupid as to let it end this way. And as I was running through the darkness, feeling sorry for myself and hearing Steve the Wolfman getting closer behind me with each step. Out of nowhere, I came face to face with a big bear. I think it was a brown bear, but what do I know? It was dark out and this creature was huge. We had spooked each other, and the bear rose back on her hind legs. I don't know what we interrupted, but the Wolfman and I were apparently barging in to some bear-exclusive event. Maybe she had her cubs nearby that we couldn't see or hear, I don't know. But this big female bear was standing up and acting like she was about to take me down. My knees felt wobbly, and I figured I was out of options. I gave up, and I accepted my fate. When suddenly, a really weird thing happened. That Wolfman guy, Steve, he had apparently taken offense at the bear standing up and yelling at me. He moved me aside, and then the bear and the Wolfman began to act all big and bad toward each other. I'm not sure either one really wanted to fight, but they each tried to convince the other one that they were willing to. It was one demonstration of dominance followed by another, with each one of them trying to prove that the other one should back down. Meanwhile, I was the only one actually backing down. I had retreated behind a tree, which I was holding onto, since my knees weren't working fully well yet. I knew I should be running away again, but I first needed to breathe deeply and prevent myself from passing out. Mostly what I remember seeing those two creatures doing was bluffing each other out. They both kept acting like they were going to do something and then stopping. It was like they wanted to confuse each other more than intimidate. They were certainly confusing me. I didn't really think that Mama Bear stood any chance at all against this werewolf monster, and I felt personally responsible for the situation. I hoped I was only imagining that she might have cubs nearby. I got the idea that if I ran away, maybe Dogman Steve might follow me and leave the bear and her family alone. So that was what I did. I chose a random direction and I ran. I was so loud that I couldn't tell if I was being followed. It felt like I ran for a day and a half, but it was still pre-dawn when I ran into a campground with this tent in it. There was a young couple inside that I woke up, and they directed me toward the closest ranger's station. Once I found the ranger station, I was golden. In fact, as I got inside and sat down on a bench, I passed out almost immediately. I think from relief more than anything else. After that, I stopped bar hopping for a while, but my friends told me they never saw Steve coming around again. I guess he was too busy partying in his groovy shack in the woods to slum it with us townies. I won't say this werewolf experience made me stop drinking, but it made me stop drinking as much, that's for certain. I partied a lot less after that, or I should say I partied on fewer nights per week. I never stopped partying hard when I did it, though. I did become a different person after that night. I started to trust people less, and I started to study them more. I began to really listen when people spoke to me, not so much out of any sense of caring for them, but out of a sense of caring for myself. I realized that people will often show you if they're going to treat you well or badly before they do it. They will often show you who they truly are if you know what things to look for. But especially, you should take care around an individual who comes right up to you and admits, "I am a real werewolf." Hey, are you a real werewolf? Then maybe you should do like this guy Steve in our episode tonight and wear a t-shirt warning people about it. That's why we've got a link in the description to our new I Am a Real Werewolf t-shirt. At the time I'm recording this, I'm unsure if we're linking to the t-shirt on our merch store, or there's other link from which we make a commission, but in either case, just know that you will be supporting the channel if you get yourself one of these from the link in the description. And now here's an important announcement from our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank. Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.